Okay, and welcome to everyone uh, to the Vasculitis Foundation's webinar. I'm Kathy Olewski. I'm the host for the Vasculitis Foundation's educational webinar series, but I'm also a patient living with MPA vasculitis. These webinars are part of the Vasculitis Foundation's commitment to patient education, and we would like to thank our sponsors, AstraZeneca, Amgen, and Novartis, for supporting these webinars. And today's webinar is Vasculitis and the Environment. After we finish the webinar today, there will be a recorded version on the Vasculitis Foundation's YouTube channel, and everyone who registered today will receive an email with a link to it as soon as it's available. Let me introduce our great speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Guy Katz is a rheumatologist and clinician investigator in the Division of Rheumatology, Allergy, and Immunology at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, MA. He's also an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's a member of the Massachusetts General Hospital Rheumatology and Allergy Clinical Epidemiology Research Program, the Massachusetts General Hospital Rheumatology Vasculitis Program, and the MGH IgG4 Related Disease Center. That's a mouthful. Welcome, Dr. Katz. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. And yes, it is a mouthful. I agree. So if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and share my slides.
Yes, that was the next thing. Just share your slides and we'll get started.
Okay. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to discuss the environmental triggers of vasculitis and what that means for the patient with vasculitis. I do have a few disclosures. None of these are related in any way to the concepts we'll be discussing today. And here are some of the objectives that I'd like to go over as a group today. So we'll discuss the theoretical basis that underlies the environmental triggers of vasculitis. We'll review some of the key known and suspected triggers of different types of vasculitis. We'll recognize the limitations of the current research and what needs to be done for us to understand these concepts better. And we'll contrast the sort of population level associations that we found and individual level causation and how it applies to the individual with vasculitis. I do have a number of slides to get through here. I am going to go through them relatively quickly because I want to prioritize making sure to have time for all of your questions. So if there's anything that I go over that is a little bit too quick and we want to spend some more time on, I'm more than happy to do that at the end.
And Dr. Katz,
So,
I forgot to do the polls that we talked about, so I
oh,
will do
that's okay.
as soon as you're done, if that's okay.
Sure, sounds good. In order to understand the effect of environmental triggers on vasculitis and how autoimmunity develops, I think it's important to just go over what the healthy immune system looks like and what happens during autoimmunity. So in a healthy immune system, at the top of the screen here, you can see some cells. These are cells of the immune system. And at the bottom left, you can see some pathogens, so bacteria, viruses, and the third little icon there on the right is early cancer cells. So very early on, before a cancer becomes cancer, there are sort of markers that tell the immune system that it's foreign, it's different from the rest of the body. And the immune system is able to recognize all of these things as foreign. And when it does, it kills them. That's the job of the immune system, is to recognize these foreign substances and make sure that they don't cause the damage that they are meant to cause. In contrast, when the immune system encounters any cells of the body, so here we have the kidneys, the lungs, the blood vessels, these are areas that tend to be inflamed in people with vasculitis. There are mechanisms in place. Every cell in our body has cell proteins that tell the immune system, this is a part of the body, this is self. This is not a foreign part of the body, so it is important for that to be protected. Now, in autoimmunity, which is when the immune system kind of starts to go awry and does not do what it's supposed to do from this perspective, what happens is those cell markers that tell the immune system, this is the body, this is not something foreign, those cell markers begin to not be recognized by the immune system. So that shield that's protecting those parts of the body slowly or quickly can disappear. And what happens when when that occurs is that the immune system now thinks that those parts of the body are now foreign. So it treats them the same way that it would treat anything else that's foreign, and it attacks those parts of the body as well. That's what causes the inflammation in autoimmunity. And where the inflammation occurs depends on where it is that the body is recognizing its own cells as foreign. And that is different for every type of vasculitis. So this slide sort of encompasses our general overview of how autoimmune disease develops. And this is true for vasculitis, and it's true for other types of autoimmune disease as well. On the left side of the screen, there's a healthy person before they develop autoimmunity. And on the right side is once they've developed autoimmunity. You can see that at the top here, underlying all of this process is genetic factors. So there are genes that you're born with, and then genetic changes that can happen to the genome over time during life. And that kind of underlies the whole risk of vasculitis. But as the individual goes through life, you can see these little areas where environmental factors can stimulate the immune system in some way. And what these environmental factors are different for every individual. And very often we don't even know what they are. But that's some of what we're going to be talking about today. They can be infections, tissue injury, changes in diet, stress, chemicals. But as we go through life, we encounter all kinds of environmental factors, and each one of these might influence or activate the immune system in a slightly different way. When you combine that with time, growth, maturation, aging, what happens is the immune system becomes activated in exactly the right way with the right combination of bad things happening, that loss of tolerance, which is the technical term for when the immune system stops recognizing its own cells as the individual as opposed to something foreign, that's what leads to the loss of tolerance. And that's the first step in the cascade that then leads to autoimmune disease and inflammation in the organs that are affected. So the key here is that the interaction between genes and environment is really what underlies autoimmunity for vasculitis and other autoimmune diseases as well. Now, this is not a talk about genetics, but I do want to just really emphasize the point that all of the environmental factors that we're going to be talking about today really happen on top of the genetic underpinning that really underlies the risk for all of these diseases. So this is just an illustration of the many genes, and there are more than these known now, but some of the genes that are known to be associated with different vasculitis syndromes. You can see that some of them have a lot of known associations, some of them less, but there are kind of known genetic risk factors for just about all of the vasculitis syndromes, some of which overlap with each other. So this really is a fundamental part of risk for vasculitis if someone is sort of genetically predisposed. I should mention most of these are not tested routinely. These are really research genes that are done because none of these genes are really, or most of these genes are not genes that are so strongly associated that we test for them clinically to see whether or not someone has a certain disease. So moving on to the real topic of the day, which is environmental triggers. And I think if we're going to be talking about environmental triggers, it's important that we actually define what that means for our discussion. So when I talk about environmental triggers, what I'm referring to is any substance that's external to the body that can stimulate the immune system to react in some way. Like we talked about, stimulating the immune system, while that can be important and good in many ways, such as when you're fighting off an infection, that's also the same process that ultimately can lead to the loss of tolerance and development of autoimmunity. So another term that we use to talk about these external substances or internal substances are antigens. Antigens are essentially anything that the immune system can recognize and react to, either positively or negatively. And sometimes these environmental triggers are very easy to define. For example, infectious agents, bacteria, viruses are very clearly something that's coming from outside of the body and going into the body and causing the immune system to react. Similarly, cigarette smoke is something that comes from outside of the body and into the body and leads and can activate the immune system. Solvents, heavy metals, other chemicals, there are infinite examples of environmental things that you can think of that would enter the body and can potentially cause the immune system to react. But sometimes environmental triggers can be kind of difficult to define. And sometimes at surface level, you don't even think of it as an environmental trigger. For example, wind patterns. You wouldn't think of someone's immune system reacting to wind, but the wind carries all kinds of things. It carries air pollutants. It carries any substances that have come up from the ground. It carries allergens, all those kinds of things. Seasonality, similarly, you don't think of a season as something external going into the body that can activate the immune system, but with changes in season, there are also changes in other things that go along with that. So, for example, viral infections are much more common in the winter than in the summer. Allergens are much more common in the spring. So with every season, you have different environmental exposures that come with that. Same thing with geographical location. The sort of usual substances that people are coming into contact with differ if they're in a city or on a farm, or if they're near the equator or closer to the poles. And earthquakes, similarly, you don't inhale an earthquake, but you might inhale some of the substances from the ground that an earthquake might release. So now I'd like to talk for a second about how we actually, from a research perspective, determine that something causes vasculitis. And it sounds like it would be something that would be easy to prove, but in reality, it's actually extremely difficult. So the ideal way that, from a scientific perspective, we could prove that anything causes vasculitis is we would follow a really large population over a period of time. We take that population and divide it. For example, if we divide it so that one half receives a certain exposure and the other half does not receive the exposure. And then we keep following those people over time and see how many people develop vasculitis. And any difference that happened between the two groups must be due to the effect of the exposure. And that way we know that the exposure caused the disease. This is the best way to know that something causes anything, and it's how we know that drugs work. We do, large randomized controlled trials that tell us exactly that. The people who got the drug did better, so we know that the drug improved the outcome. The challenge is this is really impossible and or unethical when it comes to determining if something causes a disease like vasculitis. Let's take, for example, tobacco. If we were to try to figure out if tobacco causes vasculitis, and doing it in this way would mean that we have to assign half of the population to use tobacco and half of the population not to use tobacco. There are obviously inherent issues with that, so it's really not something that can or should be done. So we have to use other ways to figure out if something causes vasculitis. And the way we do that is with observational studies. Observational studies means studies that we are observing the world as it is. We're not necessarily intervening and applying a certain treatment or exposure to different people. And there are a few ways that we can do this. We can identify a whole bunch of people who developed vasculitis, and we can look back and see, did they have a certain exposure? And then we can compare their exposure to similar people who didn't develop vasculitis and see if those people also had those exposures. Any differences could be attributed to the exposure causing the vasculitis. Another option is we can follow up or identify a group of people who were followed for a long time for some other reason. And we have a lot of cohorts like this for research purposes. And we can either in advance or later on determine what people had an exposure and what people didn't have an exposure, and see who developed the disease later on. These are both very effective ways that we can try to figure out if something causes something else. But there are major challenges with observational studies. And to drive that point home, I'd like to use this study as an example. So this is a study that looked at the correlation between chocolate consumption in different countries. So looking at per capita chocolate consumption and the number of Nobel laureates that come out of that population. And you can see here that there is a very, very clear association where the more chocolate consumption there is in a country, the more Nobel laureates they produce. But I think we all know that there's nothing that chocolate consumption does that leads a person to become a Nobel laureate. So there are other reasons that countries that have more chocolate consumptions also turn out to have more Nobel laureates. And those are, social, economic, very, very many other factors that are associated with it. This is clearly an example of what we call in the scientific community difference between association and causation. So here there's a clear association between chocolate consumption and Nobel laureates, but there's no reason to believe that that's a causation. So that's kind of the main challenge with observational studies is how do we know that what we're seeing is really causation as opposed to association? So in observational studies, it's hard to know for certain, is the observed result that we found because of the exposure or because of some other difference between the groups that were studied? And how do these results really apply to an individual, which is really what we care about when we're dealing with these things. This is especially challenging in vasculitis. They're rare diseases. The exposures that we're talking about are often rare. And like we talked about a few slides ago, these are complicated diseases with multiple factors that are leading to their development. And it's often even difficult to know when the disease exactly began. So there are a lot of challenges in how to design a study to determine whether or not something causes vasculitis. That being said, observational data are still extremely valuable, and all of the slides that we'll be going over today with examples are coming out of observational data. And if a study is designed strongly enough, we can actually come pretty close to demonstrating that there is a true causal relationship between the two things. But I mention all of this just so that we can all kind of recognize that all of the things that we're going to be talking about today, we need to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, because there's always a certain amount of uncertainty that comes from these types of studies. And then one of the last things that I'd like to make sure that we clarify in terms of definitions is the difference between a trigger of disease and the trigger of flare. And this is something that often leads to a lot of confusion, but I think it's important to differentiate. A trigger of disease onset is that exposure to a certain substance contributed to the loss of tolerance and the autoimmunity that then led to the disease development in the first place. So it's sort of contributing to the on-off switch of do you have the disease or do you not have the disease? In contrast, the trigger of a flare is in someone who already has vasculitis. Exposure to whatever it is precipitates a flare of the disease. And just because something was a trigger for one doesn't mean that it would necessarily trigger the other. And theoretically, anything that activates the immune system can be a trigger for autoimmunity or for flare. So that ranges from all, medications to infections to just about anything else you can think of. Even emotional stress can be a trigger of the immune system and can trigger flares in many people. Very importantly, most of the research that's been done up until now has really focused on disease onset, so triggers of disease rather than trigger of flare. So most of our discussion today will be focused on that just because that's where we know the most. And there really is a lot more that we need to learn about what are the triggers of flare. One of the challenges there is that they're different in everyone, so it's really hard to design a study that can really capture what are all of the different triggers of flare that occur. This is a sort of summary of many, though probably not all, of the environmental triggers that have been studied and have been identified in at least these vasculitis syndromes: giant cell arteritis, Takayasu's arteritis, polyarteritis nodosa, Kawasaki's disease, and ANCA-associated vasculitis. And you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the different diseases. ANCA-associated vasculitis has a ton of environmental triggers that have been identified, and Takayasu's arteritis has none. Does that mean that there are no environmental triggers of Takayasu's arteritis? No, it just means that if there are any, we haven't identified them yet. And part of this is you can't find something until you study it. in contrast, ANCA-associated vasculitis for a long time has been thought to be related to environmental exposure. So there's been a lot of research in that, and it is one of the more common types of vasculitis, which explains why we would have found so many of the potential environmental triggers. Now I'd like to go through some of the examples of triggers that have been identified. And again, I'll go through these slides relatively quickly, but I'm happy to go back to anything if anything is confusing or if some more details are needed. So one of the most classic examples of an infection triggering vasculitis is this paper from 1970, and this was one of a few that came out at around the same time, that showed an association between polyarteritis, which we now call polyarteritis nodosa, and Australia antigen, and we now call Australia antigen hepatitis B virus. So it was found around that time that hepatitis B virus was the cause of polyarteritis nodosa, and it turned out that it was the cause of the vast majority of that type of vasculitis. After effective treatment for or vaccination for hepatitis B virus came out, the incidence of polyarteritis nodosa really plummeted. But even these days, vasculitides that we see are still often triggered by viruses and other infections. So in the top right, you can see in Kawasaki's disease, which is a vasculitis that happens just about exclusively in children under the age of 5. This was a study that looked at exposure to viruses, different viruses, in the time preceding the case of Kawasaki's disease. And over on the right side, you can see p-values that look at the difference between the proportion of cases and proportion of controls, who are the children who didn't develop Kawasaki's disease. Those p-values, the lower they are, the more likely it is that the lower they are, the less likely it is that the difference that's seen between those groups could be due to chance. So you can see here that the p-values are all very low, meaning that the patients who developed, the children who developed Kawasaki's disease were much more likely to have been exposed to a virus. And this gives sort of indirect evidence that the virus contributed to them developing the disease. And very similar results you can see here for MPO ANCA, which is one of the two major types of ANCA-associated vasculitis. Lots of different types of infections. The bars here, if they're to the right of the dotted line, it means that they increased the odds of developing ANCA-associated vasculitis. So you can see here with a lot of different types of infection, the risk of ANCA-associated vasculitis, particularly MPO, was higher. So all of this gives us sort of indirect evidence that the infections are probably contributing to the development of vasculitis. An infection that we care about quite a lot in recent years is COVID-19. COVID-19 is known to be a very potent stimulant of the immune system, and there's been a lot of interest in understanding whether COVID-19 infection predisposes people to developing vasculitis and other autoimmune disease. And this is an example of two different studies that both showed that following COVID-19, there was an increased risk of developing vasculitis in addition to many other autoimmune diseases. Moving on to seasonal changes. So these are two studies in giant cell arteritis. The first is in Sweden. And here in the straight line is the expected amount of GCA cases that would be if there were no seasonal changes at all, if all of the months were about the same risk of developing GCA. And here you can see that in March, September, and October, the amount of cases was higher than was expected based on the line, indicating that there were more cases that were identified around then. In Jerusalem, they found a slightly different seasonal trend here, where most of the cases were in May and June. Does that mean that either of these studies was wrong? No. In different places, seasonal changes come with different environmental exposures, and that probably explains why we see these differences. There have been other studies that have, in different cohorts, that have actually shown no seasonal differences in incidence at all. So this is something that just kind of emphasizes, depending on where someone is and depending on what the specific triggers their immune system needs in order to get the disease, you find different associations. Other airborne exposures have been identified, and there are specific airborne exposures that have been studied and identified, but I think it's more helpful to just kind of look more broadly and think about the conceptual aspect of how this works. So these are two studies looking at the development of MPO ANCA-vasculitis after two different earthquakes. And in both sides, you can see on the left side of the graphs is before the earthquakes, on the right side is after the earthquakes. And in both cases, there were a lot more cases of MPO ANCA that were identified after the earthquakes than before. Once again, I'll tell you that there was another study looking at a different earthquake that didn't show any increase in incidence of ANCA-associated vasculitis after that earthquake. So again, this is something that is regionally dependent, but does show that there are airborne exposures or other environmental exposures that probably contributed to the disease development. Occupational exposures is something that it's a term that we use in medicine to just kind of give an overview for exposures that people can come in contact with that might be related to certain specific jobs. And in this study, they found that being a farmer or living near a farm, and you can imagine there are quite a bit of exposures that can go along with being in or near a farm, was associated with about a double in the odds of developing multiple types of vasculitis. And in this is a what's called a meta-analysis, where multiple studies looking at the same thing were sort of grouped together so that they could look at the overall association, taking into account the data from all of the studies. And this showed that there was about a 50% increase in the odds of developing ANCA-associated vasculitis in people who've been exposed to silica. Silica is a substance that's been long thought to be at least one of the potential triggers of ANCA-associated vasculitis, and this study did sort of confirm that. Cigarette smoke is another substance that I alluded to earlier and has been studied, particularly in ANCA-associated vasculitis. And here you can see on the left side, this is the incidence or development of ANCA-associated vasculitis in people of different degrees of smoking exposure. The higher up is less smoking exposure, and you can see as the smoking exposure goes up, which is going down in the graph, the bars that estimate how likely that person is to develop ANCA-associated vasculitis goes to the right, which is a higher risk of the disease. So that shows that that cigarette smoking is one of the risk factors for ANCA-associated vasculitis. On the right side, this is one of the few studies that actually look at the risk of relapse in people with certain environmental exposures. And in this case, smokers were actually found not only to have an increased likelihood of developing the disease, but people with the disease who were continuing to smoke were more likely to have a relapse. The next category of environmental exposures that we'll briefly go over is medications and drugs. So these are three different examples of medications that caused vasculitis, and these are very well-known examples that have been very, very well described and aren't that uncommon. But just about any drug could theoretically activate the immune system, like I was mentioning before, and could theoretically lead to a vasculitis. The challenge is we never know with any certainty whether that's the case for an individual person. So these are on the left a case of, you can see inflammation in the lungs. The lungs have a lot more white stuff, or they're supposed to be much more black than they are in that case. And on the bottom left is inflammation within the kidney. That's all due to hydralazine. So this is hydralazine-induced vasculitis. In the middle is a drug called levamisole, which is really not a drug that we use in humans. It's a veterinary drug that's used for parasitic infections, but it's often something that cocaine is laced with. And so individuals who use cocaine are at increased risk for this type of vasculitis that looks very similar to ANCA-associated vasculitis. And on the right is a medication called pegfilgrastim, which is used together with chemotherapy in people who are getting chemotherapy for cancer, and has been well described to potentially cause inflammation of the aorta, which is what the blue arrows are pointing to. This is the large blood vessel that carries blood to most of the body and can become inflamed in some people as a result of this drug. Now, we've talked a lot about some of the, and I'll mention, I did not go over all of the potential environmental exposures. We couldn't have all the time in the world to do that. But on an individual level, I think it's important to think about how these different exposures might affect an individual. And I'd like to just kind of end with this sort of thought experiment here, where if you think of the number of cases in someone who's exposed to, or in a population who's exposed to a certain substance versus not exposed to a certain substance, if it's known to be a risk factor for the disease, you'd expect more cases in the exposed than the non-exposed. But then if you think about it, you can divide the population of the exposed into two groups. The bottom part of the group, the top part of the group is the number of people that that were an excess of cases that developed in the exposed group. So it's really, you can say that the disease was attributed to the exposure. But it's important to remember that in that group, you would still expect the same number of people to develop the disease as the non-exposed, because that's just kind of the baseline risk of people who are not exposed to that substance. So there is a certain number of people who would have gotten the disease regardless. So even when we know that something is associated with the disease, we can't say for sure on an individual level, was it that exposure that led to the disease, or would they have gotten the disease either way? So some final thoughts. Environmental exposures and genetic predisposition are what lead to autoimmunity and vasculitis. Environmental exposures that cause disease differ between patients. We really don't have one cause of vasculitis. We don't expect to find one cause of vasculitis. It really is a multifactorial process, and it's multiple diseases, each of which has their own pathogenesis. And very often we actually aren't able to identify the cause. Triggers for disease may or may not trigger flare. It's important to recognize that those are different. And we need more research. And there is ongoing research that is being done to help shed light on the role of the environment in vasculitis overall. Thanks for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to answering some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Katz. We appreciate you sharing with us. And I think before we move into the questions, we'll give people time to ask questions in the Q&A box, but we're going to do a poll. Actually, it's two polls. If everyone will just look at their screen, they'll be able to answer two questions, hopefully. Two interesting questions. And the first one is, do you think your vasculitis may have been caused by something you were exposed to at some point? Just to get an idea of what people think. And then the second one is, have you ever noticed that your vasculitis has flared after an infection or other environmental exposure? So we're just about reaching a pretty good number of you, and I will end the poll and share the results with you in just a second. And everybody remember, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. There's two different boxes. The chat box is just for talking to each other. All right, let's end this poll and see if I can share the results with everybody. Dr. Katz, you should be able to see the results now. Do you have any thoughts on some of those answers?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. It looks like about 80% of you feel that the vasculitis was caused by something at some point, and about half of you have noticed that some environmental exposure may have led to a flare of the disease. And I'll emphasize here that a lot of people have personally experienced this, and much of this, may be true. The challenge is, like we were talking about, is applying the data that we have on a population level to the individual. And it's the way our minds work is that we always want to explain what's going on in our lives. That's just the natural order of business. And typically, once people develop a disease like vasculitis, they want to know why it happened. And the unfortunate reality is, usually on an individual basis, we can't prove what caused it. Uh, but people will very often sort of identify something that happened in their life at that time. And it's certainly possible that that contributed to them developing vasculitis. It's also possible that it had nothing to do with it and they would have developed the vasculitis either way. This is really interesting, and I think is kind of in line with what I see in my patients, where a lot of people feel that there's something that really contributed to it. But like I said, we just need more research to really be able to understand that on an individual level.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for participating in that poll. We love it when we get an opportunity to ask you questions also, instead of you just asking us questions. But speaking of that, I'm going to start with a couple of questions. The first one is, we wonder, do you, Dr. Katz, anticipate more research into COVID triggering vasculitis? It seems like it's a really big deal right now.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of research happening in COVID. I think the question of whether or not it contributes to vasculitis, that's one that has to a certain extent been answered there. The two studies that I showed did show that there was an increased risk, but there's a lot more that we can learn about exactly, who develops it, what types of vasculitis happen afterwards, whether COVID leads to flares of vasculitis in people who already have vasculitis. And I'm anticipating questions about vaccines as well. And there's research going on into that. So far, the research hasn't shown that, especially COVID-19 vaccines are associated with an increased risk of the diseases. But again, more research is needed.
Okay, thanks. And interesting next question. You did talk a little bit about earthquakes and things and wind and seasons, but somebody asked, can changes in barometric pressure trigger symptoms?
So I'm not aware of any research on that. But when it comes to these things, I never say never. Um, Barometric pressure changes have been by many people have been associated with worsening of their osteoarthritis and joint pain and things like that. Um, and it's certainly possible, just like it is with seasonal changes, once there's barometric changes that's associated with other changes in the environment that I could imagine could easily lead to or could lead to development of vasculitis, but I'm just not aware of any research in that.
Okay, thanks. This this is a little bit specific, but I think we'll ask it and you can comment how you would like. Can a medication exposure that contributes as a trigger to vasculitis only start to show certain symptoms months later? For example, skin symptoms 4 months, maybe 4 months after they took the medication.
Yeah, so the easy answer to that question is yes, but there's really a more complicated answer to that question. So like I said before, it's impossible to know on an individual level if a certain medication was the cause of vasculitis. There have certainly been reports of people who developed vasculitis that was thought to be due to the medication, and it was after a long time, months, that they were on it. Um, Proving that is something that's actually next to impossible to do. We don't have tests that tell us whether someone's vasculitis is due to a certain drug or whether it's unrelated to that drug. If we did have those, then we'd be able to say, yes, in your case, you developed the vasculitis because of this drug. So because of that, the longer it's been since someone's been on a drug, the less likely we are to think that it is that medication that led to them developing the vasculitis. On the flip side, if someone develops vasculitis a day after they take a new medication, that also seems fairly unlikely to be related because it takes the immune system time to adjust to the new substance and for the loss of tolerance to develop and for the autoimmunity to develop for them to eventually get the disease. So usually there's at least a couple of week delay between someone getting an offending medication and developing the vasculitis when it is medication induced. And once it's been beyond a few months, or certainly on the order of years, we tend not to really think that it's related to a medication and just something that would have happened no matter what. Again, it's something that we can't prove on an individual level in just about any case.
Okay, and I did want to say, I know some people are getting frustrated there. There is a Q&A box. If you can see it, put your question in the Q&A box. Some of you are struggling to see that. We're trying to see the questions in the chat box as well. I did want to tell all of you that if we don't get to all of your questions today, Dr. Katz has been gracious enough and we asked him before we got started if he would answer these questions in a supplemental recorded version. So if we don't get to it today, we will collect them all. We will ask him these questions in a recorded version, and we will put that near this posting on the YouTube channel so that you can see the answers to your question as well. And we appreciate you being willing to do that, Dr. Katz.
Happy to.
And I'm back to the questions that we see so far today. There have been some other questions about COVID, but I feel like you answered what you know about the COVID and vasculitis. This question is, if exercise is an environmental risk, are there any specific treatments that tend to work better?
So we don't typically think of exercise as an environmental trigger per se. The reality is when we think about triggers of autoimmune disease, any physiologic stress can theoretically activate the immune system. Now that being said, I don't want to go and advocate for people not exercising. Exercise is a good thing. We also know in a lot of autoimmune diseases that exercise is associated with better outcomes, not worse outcomes. So just to be perfectly clear, exercise is a good thing. But because any physiologic stress could theoretically activate the immune system, if someone exercises particularly hard and maybe is causing some muscle tissue damage as a result, that I could imagine that could theoretically contribute to either a flare or to vasculitis developing. But I'm not aware of that ever being studied. And again, exercise, I would say overall is a good thing.
Okay, thanks. This one is interesting since you mentioned silica. This person says that they live in Paris, France, directly above a huge subway construction site that began in 2016. Silica is a suspected agent. If silica is a suspected agent in vasculitis, this person says it's too late for me. My first symptoms began in 2021 with a final diagnosis in 2022. But I think it would be interesting to find out how many people in proximity to the construction sites have fallen ill with autoimmune diseases. But regardless, how would this kind of information be helpful in preventing autoimmune diseases? Are we just unlucky, or is it genetic? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And when it comes to environmental triggers, everyone lives in different places, everyone has different exposures. And I do want to emphasize that just because something's associated doesn't mean that it's causing the disease in everyone. So in that meta-analysis that I shared about the silica, it was associated with about a 50% increase in the odds of developing ANCA-associated vasculitis. That's a real association, but it's far from strong enough to say that the vast majority of people who are developing it are getting it because of silica. And even in a community where there's a lot of silica exposure, some, if not many, of the people who are developing ANCA-associated vasculitis in places like that would have gotten it even without the silica exposure. I'd also emphasize that if there's silica exposure, then there's probably exposure to other chemicals as well, and those chemicals might be contributing to the development of autoimmunity. And you bring up a great point with, from a research perspective, environments that have this kind of exposure to silica are kind of how we identify some of these associations. And that's how some of the associations in the studies I was showing were identified, is by looking at populations that have a lot of silica exposure and comparing people who do and don't have that exposure.
Okay. This person says the environmental triggers of vasculitis that you mentioned in the beginning, was that at disease onset or flares? I guess they were confused in the very beginning of your presentation.
Yeah, so almost all of the the triggers that I talked about were for disease onset. There's very little research on the triggers that lead to flare. And that's mostly because it's really, really hard to study flares as opposed to disease onset. Usually with disease onset, you can say kind of when the disease started. It's easy to, at least from when it was diagnosed, it's easy to say that in retrospect. But flares are much more difficult to define from a research perspective. And exposure to things over time that lead to flares is a much more complicated sort of study to do. So a lot of these studies just haven't been done because they take a lot of effort, manpower, time, and money to be able to complete those studies. So almost all of what we talked about today was triggers for disease onset. There's good reason to believe that anything that could trigger disease onset could also trigger flare. That just really hasn't been necessarily shown in the studies, with the important exception of smoking, which I did mention is one of the risk factors for relapse or flare, in addition to being a risk factor for the disease itself, at least when it comes to ANCA-associated vasculitis.
Okay, thanks. This next person asks, is autoimmune disease inherited since there is a genetic component? I know we're talking about vasculitis specifically today, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, fortunately, the answer to that is the same for autoimmune disease in general and for vasculitis, which is that there's a component that's inherited, and there's a component that is not inherited, is environmental. And how much each of those plays a role is different for every type of vasculitis and is different for every person with that vasculitis. There are some very rare types of vasculitis that are truly genetic diseases where there's a single gene that's mutated, and if the person has that gene mutation, they develop the vasculitis. That is very rare, something that's mostly seen in young children. And really the vast majority of vasculitis, I would suspect that most, if not all of the people listening today, the vasculitis really is a multifactorial process that's some genetic component and some environmental component. And those genes are things that would have been inherited, but it's not the type of genetic disease where you necessarily would expect the parents or the grandparents to have had the same disease and passed it on in that way. It's a much more complicated interaction between the genes, usually many genes that are involved in combination with the environmental exposures.
Okay, thank you. And two specific questions about different things that they wonder, could they trigger or have they been studied? Is mold exposure ever considered separately, or is it included in pollution or some other category? And somebody also asked, can exposure to jet fuel fumes trigger vasculitis after a number of years?
Both excellent questions. I'm not familiar with any studies that have specifically looked at those things. I know that there are some studies that have looked at mold in autoimmune disease, and I do believe that there are some studies that have shown that it can be a risk factor for certain autoimmune diseases. I'm just not familiar with any studies that specifically looked at that in vasculitis. But again, just like other infectious agents, any foreign substance coming into the body can lead the immune system to react. So it is theoretically possible. Some of the environmental triggers that we're talking about are even infections like the common cold. So these are things that we come in contact all the time, and the vast majority of people who come in contact with these things don't develop autoimmune disease or vasculitis. But with the right genetic predisposition, with the right timing, with the right unfortunate immune reaction to whatever that substance is, the vasculitis can develop. Similarly, jet fuel, it's a foreign substance. It's a chemical, just like some of the air pollutants that have been studied that have been shown to be risk factors. I wouldn't be surprised if jet fuel would potentially cause that as well. It's just not something that I'm familiar has been actually evaluated in the literature. And again, it's not something that on an individual basis you'd ever be able to prove, because we have no tests to determine whether the vasculitis is due to a certain substance exposure or would have happened regardless.
Okay, thanks. And the next person says, I'm confused about when something could cause vasculitis and when something requires the immune system to activate And in that weakened state, the body gets vasculitis from something else.
Yeah, so hopefully I can clarify that here. So the way that vasculitis happens is someone who's genetically predisposed gets some sort of trigger, whether that be some environmental trigger, whether that be emotional stress, or something else that activates the immune system. When the immune system is activated, it can, usually it does not. The immune system is activated every day of our lives by different things. But under the right unfortunate circumstances, it can be activated in a way where it leads to loss of tolerance, where it no longer recognizes the body's own cells as its own cells, and instead it recognizes the body as something foreign. That is the initial process that then leads to that's the initial process that is autoimmunity, when the immune system is recognizing the body as foreign, and that's what leads to the vasculitis. So I hope that answers that question.
I think that was a great stab at answering it. Someone asks, can you please summarize the top 3 environmental factors that may cause AAV, specifically Wegener's?
I don't know that we have a top 3, unfortunately, because it's different in different populations. It's different depending on how you're looking at the risk. But I'll mention some of the ones that come to mind is occupational exposures like silica and heavy metals and other chemicals like that. Actually, certain bacterial infections or bacterial species that live in the nose and sinuses. It's been found that the bacteria that live in the nose and in the respiratory tract of people with ANCA-associated vasculitis, in particular GPA, granulomatosis with polyangiitis, which is the term that Wegener's used to apply to. It's been shown that people with that disease have a different makeup of those bacteria that live in the nose and the respiratory tract. So I think that's one of the major risk factors. And again, I mean, the risk factors for the environmental risk factors for ANCA-associated vasculitis were almost everything that I listed in the chart with the summary chart. So it's really hard to say what are the biggest ones because it just depends on the individual person.
Yeah, I knew that was going to be a hard question, but thank you for trying to answer that. We had a couple of people that want to know how you get involved in these studies.
Well, first, thanks for your interest. Second, talk to your vasculitis provider because a lot of vasculitis folks are interested in research or they're working with other people who are interested in research. And that's a great place to start. I'm very fortunate to be speaking with you all as part of the Vasculitis Foundation, and the Vasculitis Foundation is a wonderful resource for exactly that. And the VPPRN, which I think Kathy's going to talk about in just a little bit. So those are all wonderful resources for you to try to get involved in these things. The research studies that are happening are constantly changing, so it's not like the answer that you'll get today is the same as the answer you'll get in a year. And just thanks again for your interest.
Yes, and you're right. And just before we finish up today, we are going to talk a little bit more about how patients can help with the research. So I'll get to that in a few minutes. And thank you, everybody, for asking those questions. I have someone that says a few months before I was diagnosed with vasculitis, there was a benzene spill in my area that I was exposed to. Do you think that could be a cause of vasculitis?
I think it could be. And I'll bring this back to what I was saying before is on a population level, I would bet that is associated with an increased risk of the disease. On an individual level, I can't say whether you would have gotten the vasculitis regardless of that exposure or not. We can say that because of the exposure, the risk of vasculitis might have been higher, but it could very well be that the questioner would have gotten the vasculitis even if there'd never been a spill. So that's something that we just can't prove in retrospect. Like I was saying before, the only way we could prove it is if we took a population and intentionally exposed half of it to benzene and intentionally not exposed the other half to benzene and seen what the difference was. And that's really not something that we can or should be doing.
Yes, we don't want you to do that. So I did want to ask, and I've already talked to you about my story with this, so feel free to involve me if you would like. But somebody says, what about the Shingrix vaccine? And with regard to flares or even development of the disease, I've been told to get the Shingrix, which is the shingles vaccine, but I'm very wary as I feel my ANCA may have developed after a COVID vaccination. So it's both. I mean, there's a lot in that. So you go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, but I hear this question all the time, and I think it's a really important question. There have been studies looking at the risk of autoimmune disease in general, not specifically focused on vasculitis, but including vasculitis after the shingles vaccine. And the studies showed a slight increase in autoimmune or in people with autoimmune disease, a slight increase in flares. Most of the flares were very mild flares after the shingles vaccine. But what we do know is that shingles itself is a very, very potent stimulator of the immune system. And Kathy has said that she was doing great for 8 years and then had an infection with shingles, and after that had a severe flare. And I will say anecdotally, I've had many other patients who've had a similar experience. So the shingles vaccine might increase the risk of a flare a little bit. Shingles itself, I think, is a much more potent immune stimulator and is much more likely to lead to a flare. I will also say that the risk of shingles in the vasculitis patient, particularly a patient who's on treatment, most of the treatments we use for vasculitis place people at particularly high risk for having severe outcomes with shingles and similar viruses. So while I think all of you are the patients who are probably the most scared of the vaccine because of the risk of flare, I think from the physician's perspective, what we're most scared of is the actual disease, because not only will the disease potentially be worse in a person who has vasculitis and is on treatment for vasculitis, but that could also lead to a flare itself. So I do think that if your doctors are recommending the vaccine based on your medical history, I wouldn't hesitate for a second just because of the history of vasculitis, but I do think it's something you need to talk about with your individual doctors.
Thank you for answering that one. I can say personally that I've had shingles twice. I've had flares after the shingles, and I'm getting the shingles vaccine in about 2 weeks. So I would prefer that and a possible flare to ever having shingles again. And I know anybody that's had it can say the same thing. Also, one question that has come up that's interesting is it seems like researching environmental triggers is really important. Do you think or expect a greater number of researchers looking into this?
Yes, there has been a lot of research going on and that amount of research is increasing. The good news is in the past couple of decades, the methods that we use to design these studies have really improved dramatically. We're able to design studies that do a much better job of coming close to actually showing that something causes the disease, as opposed to just showing that association like we were talking about before. So there's a lot of research happening. There's a lot more research that will continue to happen. So yeah, be on the lookout. There's more on the horizon.
Well, that's great news for all of us. I'm sorry, everybody, we are really out of time now, but I did want to ask one more question and then talk to you a little bit about what patients can do with our patient-powered network. Has the doctor come across a case where family members have been diagnosed with vasculitis, like 2 family members, and both of them have been exposed to the same element, like maybe silica? Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Yes, and that's in the literature as well. And when multiple family members have the same autoimmune disease, it's for one of a few reasons. Either one, really, really bad luck. And when we're talking about bad luck, we're talking about astronomically bad luck because the risk of these diseases is so low in the general population that it's It's just extremely uncommon, though not impossible, for more than one person in the family to have it just out of bad luck. Second is genetic predisposition. And that I think is going to be a really important thing when you talk about family members because they share a lot of their genes. So individuals with a family history of autoimmune disease are more likely to have autoimmune disease. So because of those shared genetic risks. And the third possibility is a shared environmental exposure that led to or that contributed to the development of the vasculitis. And the reality is it could be the same environmental trigger or different environmental triggers. Unfortunately, it's probably some combination of all of those the genetic factors and the environmental factors. I don't think that we can say definitively that it's 100% because of the silica or whatever it may be.
Super interesting. We're glad you're doing all this research. I did want to tell everybody, since we talked about shingles a minute ago, that we're doing a webinar on shingles on September 9th. So you can register for that webinar on the Vasculitis Foundation website if you're interested in that. Obviously, I'm somebody who likes to talk about it, unfortunately. Thank you, Dr. Katz, so much for spending all your time with us and answering our questions. As we wrap up today, I just want to say that the webinar will be published on the Vasculitis Foundation's YouTube channel, and each person that registered today will receive an email with a link for that. And just take a minute if I can before everybody leaves. I'm going to share my screen here if I can do this successfully. There it is. And just say that we had some discussion today about joining studies and things like that. Did you ever wonder how you could have an impact on vasculitis research? Well, the answer is that the Vasculitis Patient Powered Network, which is the VPPRN, I'm a patient champion for the VPPRN, and I encourage all patients to join the VPPRN and complete biannual forms. I can't tell you everything about it that you need to know right now, so I'm just going to ask you to visit their website at vpprn.org. What I can tell you is that it's a global patient registry. Patient data drives research in vasculitis, and providing researchers with information about you and your experience is key for advancing the knowledge of vasculitis. And so we'd like to thank also the Vasculitis Foundation for supporting and hosting these medical webinars, and our sponsors, Amgen, AstraZeneca, and Novartis. And of course, Dr. Katz, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I can't tell you how much we appreciate that.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.